By faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith.
Welcome back to Noah, the man, the ark, the flood. So Noah and his sons set out to build the ark. Estimates run between 55 and 75 years for the work to be done. As we saw in that verse from Hebrews, Noah did all of it by faith, taking God at his word, convinced a flood was coming. But have you ever thought what Noah and his family anticipated? It says in that verse that they would face events as yet unseen.
Noah was chosen to build the ark, so he obviously had his heart in the right place. He honored, he respected God. So during the time he was actually building the ark, it's hard for me to imagine that he wasn't telling everyone he could that there was trouble coming and they needed to be on board that boat.
It must have been very difficult for Noah, given the fact that nobody else but Noah and his family are preserved in the flood. That means that nobody else listened. And he probably had to endure a lot of rejection, a lot of ridicule, and nobody listening to his message, basically, other than his own family.
While they waited, they worked diligently. Plank by plank, the ark came closer to completion, adding its own silent witness to Noah's warnings that the dreaded flood was almost at hand. They gathered food for themselves and for all the animals that would be saved in that great ship. Then the final day came when the construction site just fell silent, and Noah and his family put away their tools. If they indeed hired workers outside the family, at this point, there was no hope for them. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground." And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. Everything and everyone in that first world was on the verge of destruction, and no one knew it. As Jesus said, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. As the time drew near, as the clock counted down, the earth was being prepared to come apart at the seams. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. All the fountains of the deep bursting forth. That sounds pretty ominous. But what are the fountains of the great deep?
Up to 90% of what comes out of a volcanic eruption is water in the form of steam. And we see these fountains on the ocean floor still today, hot water springs. These are remnants left over from what occurred during the flood. The fountains of the Great Deep represented where there were fractures that opened up in the Earth's crust. The outer skin of the Earth cracked and water came bursting from inside, so that you had these huge fountains, supersonic steam jets shooting up all around the globe. The water coming out, it was just been stupendous. It would have been absolutely terrifying for those who witnessed the event.
Have you ever stood by Old Faithful? That geyser just builds up pressure and then finally blows. Imagine the earth opening up with millions of Old Faithfuls. Add to that water gushing up from below, the torrential rains falling for 40 days and 40 nights. Where'd all that water come from?
You've got to understand that inside the earth there's still a lot of water. The scientists have discovered in the earth's mantle, which is under the outer skin, water molecules can get locked into the crystalline structure of the minerals inside the mantle, and they've estimated there's as much or more water still inside the earth than on the earth's surface.
In the end, we may not know exactly how God brought forth all that water. But when He did, He unleashed the powerful forces of nature in the flood. The waters swept away every single bird, animal, and human on the earth. The only survivors were huddled together, riding out the storm in the ark.
And it must have been terrifying for those people who got on the ark, 8 and the animals, to ride out that event. But it's quite clear from the language in Genesis that this was a unique, catastrophic event. In fact, the word for flood, the Hebrew word mabul, is only used of the Genesis flood. Nowhere else in the scriptures is an event like this described. This is a unique Hebrew word for this catastrophic event, mabul, the flood.
Outside the ark was pure terror and chaos. They saw the rain falling, the waters rising, the waves coming up, but there was nothing they could do except to try to run for higher ground and wonder, would any ground be high enough to escape these waters? The flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated above the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. Doesn't it sound like a battle between the dry land and the sea? The Bible simply says, the waters prevailed. That brings us to one of those details that make the flood account sound so mythical. How in the world could there have been enough water to cover Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on earth?
Well, estimates today suggest that if you smooth the earth down completely flat, there's enough water to cover the surface of the earth for a level of roughly 2 miles. So that's certainly not enough to cover Mount Everest, but at the same time we would argue that Mount Everest wasn't there in the pre-flood world, that the pre-flood world topography was much more moderate, and that the very highest mountains that exist today were really as the result of the tectonic activity of the flood.
Well, you've got to understand, Mount Everest wasn't there before the flood. That's a mistake that most people make. The Bible says all the high hills under the whole of heaven were covered and the mountains were covered. When you go to Mount Everest, you find fossils in sediment layers near the top. And so that means fossils produced during the flood. Mount Everest is a product of the flood. The earth forces that were at work at play during the flood caused the material to move around, creating new mountain belts. The Appalachians are made up of fossil-bearing sedimentary layers that have been folded and contorted. So the present mountains are not the same as the mountains before the flood.
Genesis 7:24 says, "And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days." It seems like the Bible's contradicting itself here. First it says the flood lasted only 40 days and nights. Here it says it lasted 150 days. Later it says it lasted more than a year. Are there 3 different accounts?
Well, there were 3 phases. Essentially, there was the first 40 days and 40 nights of rain. And the ark was lifted up and it floated and all life perished. And then the waters prevailed for another 110 days. On the 150th day, we read that the ark came to land on the mountains of Ararat. The mountains of Ararat, not Mount Ararat, the mountains of Ararat. And then it was another 70 odd days before the surrounding peaks were seen. That implies that it wasn't simply water subsiding, it was also earth movements. On the 150th day, there must have been sufficient earth movements to push up some mountains that the ark landed on, and it was perched there for another 2 to 3 months while the waters started to subside, but also more earth movements made more mountains around it. And you can imagine how much water there must have been if it took so long for it not only to subside, but to dry out. So just the fact that the whole process took a year indicates that it had to be of global proportions.
Is it possible that any trace of that pre-flood human civilization survived the destruction? I mean, buildings, walls, streets, anything.
It's a question we often get asked, but when you read the Genesis account, God said he was going to wipe man from the face of the earth. He was going to totally cleanse the earth because of man's sin. It was filled with violence. And so we would expect, based on what God said he was going to do and then what he described he did, that we wouldn't find any remains whatsoever of any pre-flood civilization. He wanted to judge the world and make everything start from scratch again. A new beginning, a new world.
The account continues in Genesis 8, verse 1. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. That's Genesis 8, 1 through 3a. Where'd all that water go?
And following the flood, trenches like the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean with a huge amount of water on top of it, and the water underneath the surface of the earth having come up to the surface, could well have caused the weight of the water to collapse the land to form that deep ocean trench, which would have drawn waters off the continent into those huge holes, which would have in turn have uplifted the mountain ranges that exist along the west coast of North America and South America and parts of Asia and Africa and the like. So that's part of the topographical changes that the flood very likely caused.
In other words, parts of the earth sank, parts of the earth rose, so the water retreated and went into the new ocean basin. So the waters of the flood are still on the earth today. In one sense, we could say that the earth is still recovering from the flood event.
So there's Noah. He's built a massive ark. God has brought all animal kinds to him. He's survived massive destruction. And now he and his family sit in the ark. The world they left doesn't exist. In our next session, we'll find out just how much it changed.